Today, we're tackling attention and effort with Daniel Kahneman's Attention and Effort, no less. A classic, really, in the field, since way back in 1973.
It's amazing, isn't it, how relevant it still is. Kahneman really set the stage for how we think about focus, especially these days with information overload everywhere you look.
You're so right. So that's our mission here, to unpack the core models, the surprising stuff Kahneman found, and yeah, even some practical things you can take away from it.
It's not just some historical thing either. Kahneman, he really influenced things like, well, behavioral economics, decision-making, even happiness research, why we make certain choices, what makes us feel, good about life.
One thing that really struck me was how Kahneman connects, well, basic things like how our pupils change size with how much mental effort we're using, like a window into like your brain power.
Yeah, one of the things he's known for sure, meticulously linking mental effort to those physiological responses. And it really challenges this idea that tasks are just easy or hard, like even a simple thing can feel really demanding, right? Depending on things, like a deadline looming over you.
Okay, so let's break it down a bit, starting with the basics. Kahneman talks about two core aspects of attention. Curious to hear more about those.
He calls them the selective and intensive aspects. Selective attention, that's all about what you choose to focus on. And then intensive attention, well, that's how much effort you're putting into that focus. Imagine like a spotlight, right? You choose where to point it, how bright the beam is.
Love that analogy.
Yeah.
Makes you realize attention's active. You're not just, well, passively receiving things. Now, thinking about models of attention, Kahneman wasn't a fan of those old bottleneck models. He had his capacity model instead. What's the difference?
The old models, they kind of saw attention like a single-lane road. Info processed one bit at a time. Kahneman's capacity model, though, it's more flexible. Like, we have this limited pool of mental resources. We can allocate them, like a budget for our brains.
So some tasks, they cost more brain money, even if they don't seem hard at first. Which brings us back to those pupil studies, right?
Right on. The wider your pupils, the harder your brain's working. Kahneman, he captured those tiny changes in pupil size during different mental tasks. That's how he linked them.
It's amazing how a detail like that can reveal so much. Now, Kahneman goes beyond just mental effort. He digs into how our state of arousal, that feeling of alertness, impacts attention.
Yeah, and he's careful to, clarify. Arousal isn't just one thing. He distinguishes between sympathetic dominance and attentive acceptance. Sympathetic dominance, think fight or flight. Heart racing, ready for action.
So when I'm about to give a presentation and I'm like sweating, that's sympathetic dominance.
Yeah.
But if I'm like meditating, trying to be calm and focused, that's more the attentive acceptance.
Exactly, and this links back to the Yerkes-Dodson law. That sweet spot for performance. Moderate arousal, that's the key. Too low, unfocused. Too high, you choke under pressure.
Like when you take a test, a little nervous helps you focus, but panic, your mind goes blank.
Exactly. Understanding those states, it's key, right? To get how attention works in different spots. But attention's not just like inside our heads. Kahneman looked at how our actions, especially reflect what we're attending to.
Interesting. So it's not just the internal stuff, but how that internal state shows up externally.
Yeah, he differentiates between spontaneous looking and task-relevant looking. Spontaneous, that's what we do naturally. Like, think how babies are drawn to bright colors, things that move.
Makes me think of those mobiles over cribs.
Yeah.
Captivating for a baby. But we never really lose that, do we? That fascination with certain visuals.
Nope, we don't. Contours, movement, contrast. They grab our attention automatically. And this isn't just, a fun fact. Impacts design websites, presentations, even art. Understanding that natural way we look at things can make them, more engaging.
So even before we decide to pay attention, there are these preferences shaping what we focus on. Almost like a, design superpower if you know how to use it.
Exactly. Then there's the task-relevant looking, more deliberate, right? How we search visually for information based on what we need, like scanning a page for a specific word.
Spontaneous is what grabs us without effort. Task relevant is the active search, but both part of how we process visual stuff.
Precisely. And once we've taken that visual information in, Kahneman, he gets into how we process it. He outlines what he calls the stages of perception.
Okay, let's walk through those stages. What's happening in our brains when we're making sense of, what we see?
First, you have the raw sensory data, light hitting the retina, sound waves hitting the eardrum, but it has to be organized, right, before it means anything.
Like a puzzle, all these pieces, but no picture until our brains put it together.
Right. So the next stage is grouping those elements into these meaningful perceptual units. That's where things like proximity, similarity come in. Our brains naturally group things that are close or look alike.
Like seeing a flock of birds as one unit.
Then once we've got these units, well, we assign them meaning, we make decisions, and attention. It plays a role at each stage.
So it's not just seeing something. It's that what we focus on, it shapes how we understand it, remember it, even how we react. It's much more active than just taking it all in passively.
It is. And a great example is the figure ground illusion. What we see as figure, what's background, it's not just the image, it's where our attention goes.
Like those optical illusions. You see two different images in the same picture, depending on your focus. Shows how much our perception depends on attention. But Kahneman doesn't just describe how we perceive things. He digs into how we learn to make finer distinctions, using the example of discrimination learning.
Yeah, drawing on that research with animals, humans,
Wow.
showing that we don't pay attention to every feature equally. Some features become more salient based on what we've experienced, the task at hand.
So if I'm trying to be a bird watcher, I start to notice beak shapes, plumage patterns, things that help me tell birds apart.
Exactly. Those features become more salient. They pop out to you as you become more expert. And Kahneman highlights that it's not just being exposed to information, it's the active role of attention that shapes what we learn to notice, how we categorize things.
So we're not just sponges. We're actively choosing what to prioritize based on relevance.
Right. And that brings us to another interesting area. Kahneman explores signal detection theory, all about how we decide what's signal, what's noise.
Now this is where it gets really interesting for me.
Hmm.
We're bombarded with information constantly these days. So how do our brains filter through all that and decide what to focus on?
That's exactly what signal detection theory tries to explain. It looks at, how well we can discriminate a signal from all that background noise and how our own biases come into play.
So like when I'm trying to hear my friend's voice in a noisy room, there's all that background noise I need to filter out.
Yeah.
And my own expectations about what my friend's voice sounds like play a part in whether I actually hear them.
Exactly. And Kahneman links this to attention with the concept of perceptual readiness. Our expectations, our goals, even our mood can all influence what we perceive. Like we're primed to see certain things.
Like if I'm feeling anxious, I might be more likely to interpret a harmless sound as a threat just because my brain is primed to look out for danger.
Hmm.
Kind of unsettling, but also pretty fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it really highlights how much of our perception is shaped by factors we might not even be aware of. A great example of this is the word frequency effect. We're faster at recognizing common words, and it's not just because we're familiar with them, it's because our brains are, in a way, primed to see them.
It's like those word search puzzles. The easy ones you find right away are usually the most common words because you're sort of already looking for them without realizing it.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, Kahneman delves into the many ways we focus our attention. One that always comes to mind is the classic cocktail party effect, how we can tune out all the distractions and focus on one conversation.
That's one I've always wondered about. It's like our brains have this built-in noise-canceling feature so we can zoom in on the information we want.
Right. And Kahneman looked at how that works in different contexts. He contrasted the success of what he calls stimulus set, focusing on specific features, with the limitations of response set, which is about controlling our actions. Turns out it's easier to control what we perceive than to control how we act.
So I can easily tell myself to focus on red objects in a room, but if I try to ignore an itch, that's a lot harder to control.
You got it. It just goes to show the limits of our conscious control over certain actions. Now, Kahneman also gets into this big debate about where attention fits into information processing. There's the idea of early selection, where irrelevant info is filtered out before we even process it, versus late selection, where everything gets processed, but only some reaches our awareness.
So is our attention like a gatekeeper at the beginning, deciding what gets through the door? Or more like a spotlight at the end, shining on what's already there?
It's a great question. Kahneman kind of draws on both of those ideas, suggests that there's both pre-attentive processing, where our brain is taking in information without us even realizing it, and defocused analysis, where we're actively paying attention.
So it's not a simple either. It's a more complex process where both early and late selection are happening, and our attention is kind of in the middle, influencing what we ultimately become aware of.
Exactly. And this understanding of attention, well, it challenges some assumptions about multitasking. Like, does Kahneman agree that we can't really do two things at once?
That's a big one. Especially these days, it feels like everyone's always multitasking. Can we actually do it well? Or are we just fooling ourselves?
Kahneman's research showed we can process some information in parallel, especially if the tasks involve different senses.
So I can listen to music and go for a walk at the same time, because those use different sensory channels. But if I try to listen to two conversations at once, that would be way harder.
Precisely. Performance takes a hit when the tasks are very demanding, or if they require the same mental resources. Like trying to run too many apps on your phone at once, the battery drains faster.
That makes so much sense. It seems like a simple idea, but it really explains why some combinations of tasks feel so much harder than others.
It does, and it highlights the importance of understanding our own limits when it comes to multitasking.
Well, we've covered so much ground already. From those basic models of attention, the complexities of task interference. And we're just getting started. Can't wait to see where this deep dive takes us next. Welcome back. I'm still thinking about all those fascinating insights on attention we talked about.
Right. It's amazing how complex something we take for granted really is.
Totally. We talked about the limits of multitasking, how some combinations of tasks can be, well, really taxing. Makes me think about how Kahneman explores this idea of a central processor, like a mental CEO in our heads.
Yeah, it's like this control center, constantly allocating resources, making decisions about where our mental energy goes.
So if our brains are computers, this is like the operating system, deciding what gets priority, how much processing power each task gets.
Great way to think about it. Kahneman argues, this central processor, it's a big player in how we allocate effort and attention, especially juggling multiple things.
Makes sense. Gotta have some internal mechanism to, like, make those split-second decisions about what to focus on.
Right. And Kahneman looked at, different theories about how this works. Some folks, they say it's a single all-purpose processor. Others, they think it's more like a network, specialized processors for different tasks.
So one supercomputer handling everything, or more like a team of specialists, makes you wonder how much we still don't know about the brain.
Exactly. And Kahneman acknowledges that. He looks at the evidence, but
Mhm.
ultimately he says, we got a lot to learn.
Kind of humbling, to think how much we're still figuring out about our own minds. But even with the unknowns, Kahneman, he makes some insightful observations about how we manage, well, our mental resources.
One big point is effort isn't always tied to how objectively hard a task is. Sometimes simple things can take a lot of mental energy, especially if they involve like conscious control or decision making.
Like trying to resist that second slice of cake
Yeah.
when you're, trying to be healthy.
Yeah.
Seems like a simple choice, but takes willpower.
Exactly. And he points out mental effort. It's also influenced by, well, motivation, stress, even our mood.
Oh, I can relate to that. When I'm tired or stressed, even little things feel overwhelming, like my mental energy reserves are just depleted.
Perfect way to put it. And that leads to another concept, the interplay between arousal and effort. How alertness, that state of arousal, affects how much effort we can give.
So if I'm feeling energized, alert, I'll have more mental resources for tough tasks. And if I'm drained, even easy things will feel harder.
That's the general idea. Kahneman draws on research showing that performance on cognitive tasks often follows an inverted U-shape plotted against arousal.
So there's a sweet spot, a moderate level where we're most focused, productive, too little, we're unmotivated, too much, we're overwhelmed.
Exactly. That's why it's important to find that optimal level. Some things benefit from, more excitement, energy. Others need calm focus.
Like going for a run. I might want upbeat music to get me going. But writing a report, I need peace and quiet.
Precisely. And Kahneman stresses understanding this link between arousal and effort, key to maximizing how our minds work.
Now, we touched on divided attention before, that challenge of doing two things at once. But Kahneman goes deeper into how our brains handle these competing demands.
He highlights how success with divided attention depends on a few things: the nature of the tasks, how similar they are, and even how much practice we have.
Some combos are just easier, right?
Yeah.
Like I can walk and talk pretty easily. But writing an email while having a complex conversation, that's a mental juggling act.
Exactly. Kahneman points out tasks interfere more when they're similar, Or tap into the same mental resources, like trying to listen to two songs at once. They clash, create a jumble, harder to focus on either.
Like our brains have different channels, and some tasks try to broadcast on the same frequency, creating interference. Makes sense.
Great analogy. And practice matters too. With enough, we can divide our attention better, even with similar tasks. Think of musicians playing multiple instruments at once, effortlessly. That's the power of practice.
Pretty inspiring, right? Our brains have limits, but we can push those boundaries, become more adept at handling, well, complex demands.
Absolutely. And Kahneman doesn't just stop at describing limits. He offers strategies to overcome them.
That's what I love about his work. It's not just theoretical. It gives us tools to manage mental energy better.
Exactly. One key strategy: minimize distractions, create environments that support focus, turning off notifications, finding a quiet space, even using techniques like time boxing, dedicated blocks of time for specific tasks.
Such a valuable reminder,
Yeah.
especially now, hyper-connected world. Easy to be bombarded with distractions. Protecting our attention is crucial.
Another one: be mindful of our limits, avoid overloading, breaking big tasks into smaller chunks, delegating when possible, frees up mental space.
Working smarter, not harder. Our brains have limited energy each day, like a battery.
Exactly. And like a battery, our brains need to recharge. Kahneman emphasizes rest, recovery, taking breaks, enough sleep, things to relax, de-stress, essential for our minds to work well.
We're not meant to be pushing ourselves to the limit constantly, right? It's finding that balance, effort and recovery, focused work and intentional rest.
Absolutely. And lastly, Kahneman stresses metacognitive awareness. Being aware of our biases, how they affect our attention, our decisions. Take a step back, observe our thinking. Notice when we're distracted or making choices based on, well, faulty assumptions.
Like a mental check-in, asking, am I focused on the right things? Using my energy wisely, are my decisions aligned with my goals?
Exactly. That awareness helps us be more intentional with our attention. How we manage our mental energy leads to more focus, productivity, even happiness.
We've covered the nuances of mental effort, arousal and performance, challenges of divided attention. Kahneman's work is so relevant to how our minds work, and not just theory. These are concepts we can use every day.
For sure. Attention and effort, it's a classic. Shows the power of, scientific inquiry to illuminate those mysteries of our minds and give us tools for this complex modern life.
This has been incredible so far, but we're not done yet. Next time, we'll explore the broader implications, connecting these ideas to fields like behavioral economics, decision-making, and even happiness research. Stay tuned. Welcome back to, well, the final part of our dive into Daniel Kahneman's attention and effort. We've covered a lot, from the mechanics of attention to those sneaky ways our brains try to multitask. But I'm excited for this part, exploring the bigger impact of Kahneman's work. Because it's clear, attention and effort, they aren't just lab things. They're like woven into how we experience life.
You're absolutely right. Kahneman's research, it's had this ripple effect across so many fields. Behavioral economics, decision-making, even happiness research. It helps explain, what we're drawn to, why we make the choices we do, and ultimately what makes us feel, fulfilled.
The connection to behavioral economics, that's really intriguing to me. How does understanding attention and effort change how we think about, like, everyday money decisions?
Well, traditional economics, it often assumes people are perfectly rational, always making choices that, maximize their benefit. But Kahneman's work, alongside Amos Tversky, they challenged that, showed how our biases, our limited attention, even relying on mental shortcuts, can lead to, well, irrational choices, not the best ones.
So we're not those perfect economic machines like classical economics thinks we are. Emotions, our attention spans, or lack thereof, jumping to conclusions, all that plays a role, often without us even realizing it.
Exactly. And a key insight from behavioral economics is this thing called framing effects. Basically, how information is presented, the context of the choice, and Kahneman's attention work. It helped explain why framing is so powerful.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Imagine you're choosing between two medical treatments. Treatment A, described as having a 90% survival rate. Treatment B, 10% mortality rate. Logically, they're the same, but studies show people go for treatment A, the one framed as survival.
Because survival just sounds good, right?
Yeah.
Even if the outcomes are the same. It's wild how wording can have that effect.
It is. And Kahneman suggests this happens partly because our attention, it goes to the most salient info. In this case, that word, survival. We prioritize what feels positive, emotionally appealing, even if it's logically no different.
Makes you realize how easily our attention can be, well, manipulated, even in big decisions like medical stuff.
Absolutely. That's why it's important to be aware of those framing effects. Try to look past the surface so we make more rational choices.
So understanding how attention gets hijacked by framing, it can actually make us better consumers, more critical thinkers, and lead to, well, better decisions overall.
You got it. And beyond just economics, Kahneman's work has implications for, well, happiness, well-being, that whole area.
Let's talk about that. How does attention tie into something as, complex as happiness?
One big thing is this: what we focus on. Huge impact on our emotions. If we're always on negative thoughts, worries, comparisons, unhappy. But shift that attention to positive stuff, gratitude, meaningful connections. That can cultivate well-being.
Like that saying, right? Where attention goes, energy flows. What we focus on, good or bad, it kind of grows.
Perfect way to put it. And Kahneman's research shows it. He showed that our memories of experiences shaped more by the peaks, the ending, not the whole duration or the average.
So a vacation that ends great, even if it had some rough patches, we'll remember that better than one that was just okay, but had a bad ending.
Exactly. It's the peak end rule. Our attention, it goes to the most intense recent stuff. And those moments, they matter more when we judge the whole experience.
So interesting. Means we can kind of shape our memories, our happiness, by paying attention to those peaks, trying to end things on a high note.
Absolutely. And this ties into another Kahneman idea: the experiencing self versus the remembering self, the one living it in the moment, versus the one forming, recalling the memories. And they don't always agree.
So like the experiencing self stays at a party even though they're tired, because it's fun right now. But then the remembering self, they're the one who regrets it the next day with a headache.
Exactly. That tension, right? Instant gratification versus long-term well-being. Sometimes we get caught up in the moment, even if we'll regret it.
Reminds us to be mindful, right? Not just how something feels now, but how we'll remember it later.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that attentional control, choosing where our energy goes, managing our mental resources. It's tough, but with awareness, we can make better choices, create better experiences, and ultimately live happier lives.
This deep dive, it's been incredible. From the basics of attention to those big implications for, well, economics, decisions, even happiness. Daniel Kahneman's Attention and Effort, a landmark work for sure, still shaping how we see the human mind.
Absolutely. A book that challenges us to rethink how we see the world, make choices, what matters, and it gives us tools, to be more focused, more intentional, and hopefully more fulfilled.
This has been a testament to the power of understanding, well, our own minds. We hope you've enjoyed exploring these ideas with us, and that you'll keep on discovering the incredible power of your own attention. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.